Welcome to Lancefield on the Line. My name is David Lancefield, and today we're going to be talking about pitching, sales, innovation, behavioral change. Imagine this situation. You're in the execco board meeting, pitching to investors. You've got your best idea, and it doesn't land. It doesn't happen. Why? Why not? Well, that's what we're going to be talking about today, and hopefully getting some wisdom and some, if you like, disruptive wisdom against the conventional wisdom that's going to come from David Schonthal, a business school professor, venture capitalist, designer, and author, a multi-talented individual, clearly, the clinical professor and director of entrepreneurship programs at the Kellogg School of Management, fantastic school, a venture advisor at IDEO, having had a number of roles there, and an operating partner at Seven Wires Venture, a health tech-focused VC, and many more roles. How do you pack it in? I have no idea. Welcome, David.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Great. Well, you are the co-author, as you know, of a new book, The Human Element, Overcoming the Resistance That Awaits New Ideas. I love that emphasis of awaits new ideas. We're going to be obviously coming on to that. A book that's released on October the 5th, 21. And today you're coming in from Chicago. And congratulations again for the book. And thank you for coming on the show.
My pleasure.
Right. So we're going to get stuck in. Sounds like a familiar situation to many of us. As I mentioned, you developed an idea, you're proud of it, you sell it to your best abilities, and it doesn't get the money, doesn't get the backing, doesn't get the sponsorships. Now, you talk about two concepts in your book, fuel and friction, which I love. We probably know quite a lot about fuel in the context of business. Tell me more about those two concepts and how they apply and the interaction between the two, just to start off with.
Yeah, I'm happy to, and maybe just by way of orientation, the origin story of the book, I think, does a nice job of explaining this. So my background, as you pointed out, is in entrepreneurship, innovation, venture capital. My co-author, Loran Nordgren, is a psychologist and an expert in influence and in persuasion and behavior. And together, about 3 years ago, we started thinking a lot about this problem, me from an entrepreneurship and innovation lens and he from a psychology perspective, about why it is that even though your market research says that people are going to clamor for an idea or lots of people give you positive feedback about a product or a solution or a venture presentation or whatever it might be, why is it that at the moment of truth, people tend to walk away? Like, what happens in that moment?
Yes.
And so together, through these different lenses, we started looking at this out of interest, I think, for helping our portfolio companies and helping our student entrepreneurs better navigate and forecast the headwinds that stand in the way. And Loran, for understanding all of the unique human factors that play into that. And we have framed, as you mentioned in the book, this metaphor of fuel and friction, fuel being all of those forces that push people towards change, and friction being all of those headwinds that tend to stand in the way of change. And historically, when we talk about innovation, when we talk about entrepreneurship, when we talk about design, our emphasis is really on fuel. How do we make the thing better? How do we add a feature? How do we add a benefit? How do we change the price? If people aren't saying yes to it, clearly there's something wrong with the product, or we're not talking about it appropriately. And what we don't often pause to think is maybe it's not the offer or the pitch or the idea that's the problem. It's how deeply we've considered the human element, which is the title of the book, the human beings for whom we're trying to affect that change. And so this book really explores that side of the innovation equation, not how to make ideas more magnetic or how to add features and benefits to make something more sizzly, but how to address these headwinds that are frankly just part of our psychology as human beings and our natural aversion to change.
Fascinating. So what gets in the way? Because what you described there, and that's the beauty of a brilliant idea and a very compelling book, which I've loved reading, is that sounds quite intuitive. But what gets in the way of people not thinking about the friction? Is it their passion for their product, their venture, whatever they're pitching? Is it the pride that they have in it and they stop, if you like, listening, anticipating the audience? What is it that gets in the way?
I think that's part of it. I think that we tend to be, and I think it depends on the audience that you're talking about, but maybe speaking specifically about entrepreneurs, we tend to fall in love with our idea. We tend to fall in love with our business. And we always, and because that's the hero of the story, we think that somehow if it's not catching on, that is the thing that must evolve. We tend to look at things through our own lens and through our own perspective, and don't as readily consider those that we typically don't have much control or influence over. It's similar to if you drive down the motorway and you see somebody swerving in and out of traffic and generally driving like a maniac, your first instinct is that person is a jerk or that person is inebriated, because we're thinking about it through our own context.
Yes.
But the answer could be that that person's on their way to an emergency. They're an EMT or a physician, or they're desperately in need of using the loo. And we tend to view external situations through our own myopic lens instead of thinking about all of the factors that influence others. And so I think, and hopefully one of the things that you picked up in reading this is once you start to look at the world through the lens of friction, it's sort of hard to unsee it. It's sort of hard to not say, all right, well, what are the sources of friction that exist in this interaction with my colleagues, or this interaction with my kids, or this interaction with people that I'm trying to influence or persuade.
And it's a very constructive approach, because one of my first reactions when I started reading was, is that a bit of a negative mindset? And of course, there may be real blockers, obstacles to how somebody thinks of your idea, something they don't like. But actually, the whole aim is to, if I get over those obstacles, perceived or real, in order to get your idea through, to get the approval and so on. So actually, it's a very constructive, approach. But how much of this can one do, if you like, oneself, in terms of reframing, thinking about the other's perspective and so on, versus having, that sounds sensible, but pretty hard if you've grown up as a, salesperson, a venture person, an entrepreneur. And I see a lot of people who struggle to change, particularly as they get a little bit older. How much do you need other people to help you to sort of challenge you to think about frictions as much as fuel?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that question. Maybe just going back to one thing you mentioned before, which I think was a really important point, is that once you spot frictions, and we talked about like once you see the world through this lens, it's kind of hard to unsee the world through this lens. Hopefully the other thing that you picked up from the book is that the solutions are not terribly difficult. It's just a matter of identifying the problem. And once you identify the friction, the solution in some sense becomes self-evident. And sort of using that as a segue to your next question about how do you go about doing it and who do you need to involve? Our hope is that the frameworks that we talk about in this book, and using tools that we talk about in this book, like friction maps, help eventually become part of the innovation and the design process, like Alex Osterwalder's business model canvas, or
spoken to him on this series. That's a good plug for him and me. And thank you.
Business model canvas. It's excellent.
Yeah, indeed it is. Yeah.
Or the desirability, viability, feasibility framework of design thinking. Our hope is that in the process of developing new ideas, teams will sit down and look at a friction map and say, okay, if we are successful at creating this strategy or this initiative, what sources of friction might we anticipate happening for our intended audience? And just by being able to spot them, just like in the business model canvas, we can make hypotheses about what we think these things are, and then design experiments and prototypes to help address and overcome those frictions. And the key is that the earlier on in the design and innovation process you can have consciousness of those things, the smoother the path will be.
So the success of the book, beyond the usual metrics and so on and fame that you'll no doubt get, is actually behavioral change of the people and actually the process change, if you like. So people actually think of it much earlier. It's a real thing rather than just a framework. So how do you think you operate in this world day in, day out? You have for years, even with your youthful looks. You have a lot of experience in different organizations. How are you personally going to, beyond talking about the book, which is fantastic, but in your own world, how have you used the tools that you just talked about to change the investment process? Do you practice what you preach is what I'm really saying.
Oh, God, yes. And by the way, if I look youthful, it must be like some Zoom filter that I've applied.
Yeah, I'm good on tech that way. Yeah.
Yes, is the short answer. And in fact, in the process of writing this book, I've been sort of gobsmacked by how many different ways it shows up. Again, from when I'm trying to implement change in my household with my 10-year-old and my 7-year-old.
Very good.
friction theory comes into play there, where you understand their sources of resistance to new ideas, how to use the benefit of understanding their psychology to make it easier for them to say yes. But I've actually been looking at our entire portfolio at 7wire through this lens. All of these businesses and entrepreneurs that are attempting to affect meaningful change in healthcare. I think, as you pointed out, even when something is a good idea, it doesn't necessarily mean people will say yes. And healthcare is one of these environments that is burdened with inertia. There's a lot of ways that things have been done for decades and decades and decades. And yes, we're starting to question them and starting to say, well, maybe it's better if we use electronic medical records, or maybe it's better if we have chronic disease management platforms that can help support people's journey towards a healthier lifestyle. But just because these things exist and just because the data suggests that they're useful doesn't mean that doctors and nurses or clinicians will change the way they practice medicine simply because you show up. There's 20, 30, 15 years of established behavior that needs to be addressed. So with all of our portfolio companies at 7wire, whether you're working in disease management or whether you're working in workflow, improving workflow inside of clinics, recognizing that there are a lot of individuals or forces that will oppose that change. And how do we design what we refer to as the intervention? How do we design the introduction of this thing to minimize those sources of headwinds? Now, it doesn't mean we'll get rid of them entirely, but recognizing, like, what is the emotional friction when you're asking somebody to change their behavior? Are they going to be anxious that they're going to look inexperienced relative to younger practitioners because they're not as technologically savvy?
Yes.
And we don't often think about somebody's anxiety or fear as being a reason for them to say no to a technology, but it is. And the surprising thing about friction is sometimes it's really innocuous things that can cause enormous headwind or obstacle to getting a new idea adopted. But once you clue into it, you're like, oh, of course. And now that I know that you're fearful about it, now that I know that you're anxious about it, let me design some way of in-servicing this to bring you up the learning curve in a way that gives you more confidence. But if I don't know that that's the source of friction, then I might add features and benefits and I might change the price, which actually makes the problem worse, because now I'm adding features and benefits to something that you're already intimidated about using in the first place, and I can actually increase that source.
You're turning up the volume even more. It's interesting, in the organization that you and I were part of in different stages in PwC, I now remember a group of digital mentors who are young individuals who are digitally savvy, working with the partners who were, they wouldn't say it, of course, anxious about some digital tech. And it's very effective in terms of actually bridging the gap. Whether they had that implicitly in their mind about the friction, but it worked. It worked really well.
None of them are going to readily say, like, I'm actually quite intimidated. Or they're never going to say, this makes me anxious or nervous or afraid. Emotional friction, of the 4 frictions that we talk about in this book, and one is inertia, which is the status quo. The other is effort, how much effort is required to get somebody to change. The third is emotion, the unintended anxiety and fear we cause in others by implementing this change. And the fourth is reactance, which is people's aversion to being changed. But this third one, people don't walk around saying, I'm afraid of this or I'm intimidated by that, particularly,
very rarely. Yeah.
Particularly if they're in a position of authority, because it sometimes is perceived as weakness or inadequacy, when in fact, like, once you figure it out, that's really the key to getting things moving forward.
How, in your interactions with, if you like, organizations or individuals pitching, if you like, to you, how easy have some of them found it to, if you like, to, once they understand the concept of friction, change the dial, if you like, and apply the tools? The reason I ask that is, as I said, I can imagine people at one level understanding it and saying, nodding and so on, but it's quite a rewiring of your mindset and your approach to life and your approach to developing a proposition. And some of these individuals are pretty big characters, and it requires a degree of self-awareness, a degree of humility, empathy as well, to do what you just described. How easy is it to affect the change in some of the people who've grown up with, fueled up, if you like?
Yeah. Again, it sort of depends on the context, but one of the things I find, David, is that oftentimes this solves the mystery of something they've been wrestling with for a long time.
Yes.
Yeah. And so what we see more often than not is not, hey, you've pointed out these sources of friction, and now I need to adjust the way I work to integrate this methodology into how I practice. It's more like, oh man, that actually explains a lot. We've been focusing our attention on increasing fuel, and been confused by why nobody's adopting despite all of the features and benefits we're adding. And when we expose these individual sources of friction, usually there's a light bulb that goes off in somebody's head and says, well, that explains so much. And we had never considered inertia or reactance. And again, once you spot the source of that hangup, it's like removing a log out of a log jam. It just frees up so much more possibility. And so I think the best way to recruit people to this new way of looking at innovation is to just show them how it works in practice, and the results kind of speak for themselves.
Yeah. So if you are one of those individuals who's sort of very early stage in some form of concept, how do you get the right blend? I'm mixing metaphors here, but how do you get the right blend right at the beginning? Where do you start?
I think it's asking yourself a few questions up front. And again, there's this friction map that we've developed, and you can
tell us more about that. I like it. And so give us a flavor.
Well, it's a bit like Alex's business model canvas, which is it externalizes a lot of these ideas and puts them into a framework that can be posterized on the wall and becomes a collaborative tool for teams. So you can stand around with a bunch of Post-it notes and say, all right, well, what do we think the sources of inertia related friction are for this idea? And basically what we're asking there is, how much do they have to part from the status quo or the way they do things today to adopt this change? And that provokes a conversation amongst the team to say, well, I believe it's a lot, I believe it's a little. Well, what do we need to know? How do we go about finding out in research to find out if that's true or not? What kind of effort is required? Economic, mental, physical exertion is required for them to make this change? Do we feel like this is a source of potential friction? If so, let's note our hypotheses and then design some experiments to find out. What negative feelings could this provoke in others, either our users or others in the organization, that might cause some friction? And will people feel pressured to change by this? Will they feel like they're included in the process of design, or will they feel like change is being imposed upon them? And even just having these conversations around these core questions is a great place to start.
It's very liberating, because I imagine some liberating, as you say, the logjam point, or the fact that you're really getting at the sort of jobs to be done and the obstacles to get there. I think that's very, very, very appealing. I do think it's a mindset shift for many people, and requires a different type of conversation in the innovation process, a conversation rather than a broadcast sort of message, which is, hey, I've got a fantastic idea, get a lot of people in a room or virtually. I'd love to hear your thoughts, but basically what they're saying is rubber stamp it at an early stage, which does happen, especially with big characters. What about the organization?
I like hearing you use the phrase jobs to be done, because I think there's also a lot of symmetry between jobs theory and friction theory. And jobs theory really espouses this idea that what really matters is the progress people are trying to make in their life, not the products that enable them to make that progress. Yes. And going back to your original question about why is it that entrepreneurs fixate on the fuel instead of the friction, it's because they've got that product orientation instead of a progress orientation. But once you realize what business you're really in, all of a sudden friction becomes part of the consciousness. And I think jobs is a great way of understanding that as well.
So if you had to paint the picture, another canvas metaphor, of the, if you like, the VC space that you occupy and operate in and teach in, how big a shift in thinking and practice is it from now to where you want it to be? Is this a radical shift? Is there momentum in the direction you just described? How big a shift is it?
In terms of the application of the theory?
Yes, and what you described.
I don't know that it's a radical shift. I think it's just a different way of looking at a problem that VCs and entrepreneurs have been struggling with for the last 10 years, which is getting somebody interested in your idea is not the same as getting them to adopt it. And we look at traffic to a website. We look at the cost per click of getting somebody onto your website is one KPI. It's sort of some ways a vanity metric of success in entrepreneurship, of traction, but that's not the same as having them actually buy it and use it. And again, I think the entrepreneur's typical instinct is, if they're not converting, let's lower the price. If they're not converting, let's talk about it differently. Let's sell it differently. And what we're saying is, you can continue to do that, but you may find it's less expensive, more fruitful, and faster to understand the other side of the equation, which is what are these things that are likely causing this impasse? And rather than make our idea the focus, how do we make it easier for these humans we're trying to benefit to say yes?
It's a very inclusive approach, or should be an inclusive approach, because considering those factors in the way you just described either requires the same people to think and practice in a different way, or could bring in other people from, whether it's a startup, scale up organization, who either have that view of psychology, have a different perspective on life, and actually brings a greater degree of inclusion of a team. And I'm a big fan of inclusion, not for political correctness, although I think it's important in terms of representation. That's something I'm passionate about. But actually, inclusive teams, carefully choreographed, and in terms of the composition, generally more high performing. So actually, it's very beneficial in inclusion, which I think is also fuel in a different context for the growth trajectory of a nascent organization.
It's true. And there's some great examples in the book in particular. I mean, one of the problems that I'll identify in the world of design and innovation consulting is it's typically a young person's game. Like the median age of designers and design firms is 32, 33. I'm not quite sure, but they tend to be younger individuals. But yet, these are young people who are trying to design products for people who are in their 80s and their 90s and helping them age in place. There is a huge amount of dissonance between an able-bodied 32-year-old and the way they view the world, both functionally, socially, and emotionally, from an 85-year-old person that you're trying to help live more comfortably in their homes. And yet, the teams that design these products continue to be 30-year-olds and 40-year-olds. Yes. There's this great story from IDEO. In fact, a number of years ago, we had a special out on a TV program in the United States called 60 Minutes, which was looking at what's the latest thinking with design thinking. And at the time, our founder, David Kelly, was on the show talking about design thinking, sort of version 2.0. And this one viewer in the audience was a woman named Barbara Beskind, who was living in and around Palo Alto, which is where IDEO's headquarters were at the time. She was a retired designer, had spent time in industrial design and occupational design when she was active, but has been retired for some time, saw the program and said, boy, I'd really like to participate in this process, and applied for a job at IDEO at age 90. And Fantastic. Of course, whoever received this application in the Palo Alto office was like, this is awesome, like, yes, please. And so for years, she would come to IDEO on a regular basis and sit in with project teams. Fantastic. We're designing projects for people with macular degeneration or arthritic hands. And the perspective that she brought is somebody who has experienced those problems and experienced those challenges, both functionally, but also emotionally and socially, completely reoriented how these teams thought about it in a really positive way. So all of this is to reinforce exactly what you said, and more inclusivity, particularly bringing the voices of the people we're designing for into the process, is hugely beneficial.
That's a brilliant example, and so refreshing, because there are a lot of organizations who talk a great game and actually produce research and thinking on, the aging population and the 100-year life and so forth, and then actually make it really, really hard for people to either stay in the organization or to actually work in them. So for somebody to actually receive the application, say it's a great idea, and then actually involve the individual for a period of time. I mean, I think that's absolutely fantastic.
Barbara's still going. She's still active in designing. She's almost 98 now. I mean, it's just she is one of the most incredible people I've ever had the experience of getting to know, and her story is just fantastic.
That is fantastic. Now, you operate in a number of different worlds. I'll pick two. So the VC world and the business school world, both subject to substantial change. Arguably one more than the other, I may suggest. In a nutshell, what can they learn from each other in the area you described and more generally?
Oh, God. I mean, in some ways, they both need to have growth mindsets, right? I think that both the VC world and the world of business school have operated in a certain way that has worked pretty well given the market conditions. And, I think I'm not sure which one you were alluding to that needs to change. I think they both have opportunities to change. But I think that in both situations, sometimes we run into problems when we rest on our laurels and think that the way we've been doing things, even though it's been working up until this point, will persist and continue to work in the future. I think it's always really important to ask, why are we doing it this way? Is this still the right way to do this? Are there other ways to do it? And I think that has to do with education and the courses we design and the experiences we design and how we deliver content, but it also has to do with how we support portfolio companies and the types of deals that we invest in. Yes. And I think just making sure that it's part of the corporate ritual or the school ritual to constantly pause and say, all right, is this still the way we ought to do it? And even though maybe our peers aren't doing it this way, should we think about going left when everybody else is going right? And I think the pandemic, at least in business school education, has been a forcing function to get us to rethink some of these things. And I think there are some things we've done in business school during the pandemic for the last 18 months that I hope will persist, because I think they're more effective ways of conveying knowledge to students. But I think it's been a good excuse for us to every now and then pause and say, is the way we're doing it still the right way for the future?
And that friction lens that you talked about, once you put it on, you can't take it off, I think applies, because in the business school world, there are lots of frictions, if you like, in terms of how people learn, how it's accessible, how people then use their learning beyond the classroom and so on. So it's interesting the way,
lots of status quo. Like, why on earth do we still convey knowledge by a professor standing in front of an amphitheater and talking to 150 people? And like, why is that the way we have done things for a century?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, you talk about the four elements, and you referred to them earlier. Let's just go back to that. Is there a hierarchy between the four? And they all work? Is there a hierarchy, or are they all important in terms of inertia, emotion, and so on?
There's no hierarchy. It's a good question, in one that deserves some clarification. There's no hierarchy, but if you think about it like an image, like a medical image, and you inject contrast dye into a patient to highlight blockages and sources of problems, you inject the dye and then the sources of problem get amplified in the image. I think the friction map and the way of looking at the world through friction theory isn't that one is more important than another. It's just making sure that you're injecting that contrast dye to light up the ones that might be a factor and addressing those. It's not that every friction is present in every situation, but knowing specifically which friction you're working with is the key to overcoming it.
And universality, I'm always curious to understand the application of your frameworks and thinking in different contexts. So I'm curious in that aspect, these four aspects, how universal do you find they are across organizations of different shapes, sizes, operating in different countries?
Yeah, awesome question. The phenomena are the same across any human being, but the catalysts are different. So we talk about a case study, in fact, in the back of the book, about Dubai, the Emirate of Dubai, and trying to enhance university entrepreneurship programs. They had noticed, not surprisingly, that their reliance on fossil fuels and oil production was probably not a sustainable competitive advantage. In fact, the UAE has become a net importer of oil versus a net exporter of oil. And so in thinking about how to create an economy that is future fit, one of the hypotheses they had is we need to train more university students to want to be entrepreneurs and come up with tech and other things that accelerate our economy, which is totally sensible. But unlike the United States or London or Germany or other places, like university students in Dubai don't particularly aspire to being entrepreneurs. In fact, even weirder, they tend to aspire to going into government service, because unlike the US or the UK, working in government service is a really high paying job. There's this nobility and allegiance that people have to making the Emirates a better place to live, which is fantastic. So it's a different orientation, and the risk involved in entrepreneurial failure, or at least the stigma of entrepreneurial failure, unlike San Francisco, where you dust yourself off and you try again, and it's actually a badge of honor, failing in a startup after you've graduated from university not only brings potential embarrassment to you, but also by extension to your family and your community. It's a heavy weight. And that's obviously a huge source of emotional friction. So that's a friction that exists in Dubai that doesn't necessarily exist in London or in Palo Alto. Fun story about that, actually. One of the most interesting things Dubai has done to address this, one of the most interesting pieces of technology they have implemented to overcome this emotional friction of students not necessarily wanting to become entrepreneurs because of the anxiety of their parents or their family, is that the ruler of Dubai, Mohammed bin Rashid, will write a thank you note to the parents of students who have decided to become entrepreneurs, personally acknowledging the contributions that the family and that those entrepreneurs are making to make Dubai a more future fit economy. And just by receiving this personal gesture from His Highness, not only does it completely reframe that this isn't a risk, this is actually a national calling, but getting this object, this artifact of gratitude becomes this source of pride and privilege, and just reorients how people think about this source of cultural and emotional friction into something that it can actually be a win for change.
That's a very smart intervention. Very smart indeed. So let's close with this question. You alluded to the more personal application of your thinking and frameworks in reference to your 10-year-old. But where have you used this to the best effect outside your professional life, your family, yourself, where you've actually, it of course, but where you've genuinely, materially, and sustainably changed the way you either think or practice an aspect of your life?
So this is a moment to give a ton of credit to Loran Nordgren, who's my co-author and a psychologist. He has made me think in particular about the friction of reactance, people pushing back against change and remedies for managing that. And ordinarily, I would have in the past kind of used brute force to try to get great ideas across the line, or used facts and data to try to convince somebody that one way of doing things was better than another way of doing things. And typically, coming from PwC and other places, like those elements of evidence are the go-to, right? Let me show you the proof.
Yes.
Let me show you the evidence. And I mean, I think we see this in public health, at least in the United States right now, that sometimes strong evidence is the worst evidence. And it's not about convincing somebody that your facts are the right facts. It's about trying to engage them in a way that feels a little bit more delicate to the fact that they're likely to push back if they feel pushed. So even things like, instead of giving an idea to an audience and saying, what do you think? Asking them for advice about how I might implement that idea gives them this sense of ownership.
Yes.
Or rather than talk about all of the data that supports you getting a COVID vaccine and here's why you should get it, and people are dying and respiratory effects and long COVID symptoms, et cetera, maybe rather than try to blind them with science, the answer is, the way to overcome it is to say, hey, is there anyone in your life that has suffered from a disease, a contractable disease, that you wish they had handled differently, or you wish society had handled differently to prevent that? And that gets them out of COVID. And they're like, well, yeah, malaria or some other type of disease that may have contracted. Now I'm looking at the world through their lens, through their eyes, and saying, yes, all right, how did that affect you? What do you wish would have been done differently? And then use that to say, now, if you were me trying to help people understand the benefits of a COVID vaccine, what would you advise me to do? And it just completely reorients the dynamic from I'm telling you a thing or two about a thing or two, to now you understand from your own personal experience how these things can affect families and individuals. What advice might you give me? And now you're an author in the strategy versus a recipient of it.
That's beautiful. The quality of questions and listening throughout what you've discussed is critical. And there's a big coaching element to this as somebody who's an executive coach as well as a strategist. There's a coaching mindset and skill set that needs to be imbued in the whole innovation process that perhaps hasn't been before. Hey, David, we could talk for hours. We won't. I'm respectful of your time and attention. It's been wonderful to chat. Where can people find out more about you, your book, your endeavors?
Thank you for asking. We've got a landing page for the book, humanelementbook.com, where you can learn a little bit about what's going on with the book and the release, and some blog posts and content that we're continuing to update. You can find me on the faculty page at the Kellogg School of Management with latest publications and articles, and and LinkedIn and Twitter, I guess.
Of course.
Where everybody lives these days.
Indeed, as well as the real world. Well, that is the real world in a different context and different platform. Look, you've been refreshingly clear, candid, sharing some great examples and making it practical and real. So I can already think about the way my own practice might change, and I'm sure people listening and watching this will do so too. I'm very, very grateful for your time. And that was another edition of Lancefield on the Line.